Welcome to Beverly Hills View. I'm Josh Gross. Our guest tonight, the 27th Chief Justice of the state of California, Ronald M. George. Welcome.
Glad to be here, Josh.
Mr. Chief Justice, your book, Chief, The Quest for Justice in California. What made you want to write the book?
Well, actually, it wasn't my idea, but the Supreme Court Historical Society asked me to do an oral history, and that started off as a series of interviews that ultimately were 20 in number, over 65 hours, and halfway through they decided they would publish it. That's through the University of California's Institute of Governmental Studies as a hardback book, and then they gave me the opportunity to edit it, which took several months.
You're a Beverly Hills native, graduate of Beverly Hills High School. Your sons went to Beverly Hills High School. We're going to talk about that in a moment. But you mentioned the very unique format of this book is it's in an oral history format. Basically, a researcher asks you a question and then you respond. So it's not the traditional memoir. Why did you want to do it in that format as opposed to a traditional memoir?
Well, that seemed most attractive to me, but again, it wasn't really my choice. There was an oral history that was commissioned, and I felt comfortable with that, and I'm very glad in retrospect to have kept that conversational mode. I think it makes it more interesting to readers than just a dry lecture type of format.
Well, you've had quite a career, 38 years on the bench in various judicial capacities, of course, culminating in being Chief Justice. And for those of us junkies of California politics, we love this stuff. So don't feel it was not too long at all. I loved all of it. A couple questions, of course, come to mind right away. First of all, over 38 years in judiciary, you saw a lot of changes. You saw a lot of changes to the courts. Here, of course, we've lost our Beverly Hills Courthouse, which we're so upset about, and we want to see that come back. Did you find the administration of justice was more challenging than actually serving on the bench?
Yes, it was in one sense. Actually, people don't realize that the position of Chief Justice encompasses three separate jobs, basically. One is being 1/7 the production of the opinions of the court. In other words, assigning the cases to my 6 colleagues and taking my 7th share. The second part is running the court itself. Those are pretty well manageable. They're arduous tasks, but the third part, being Chief Justice not only of the Supreme Court but of the entire judicial branch, is quite burdensome, and it involves basically being CEO of a judicial branch that's the largest in the United States, twice the size of the federal judiciary, over 1,700 judges, 20,000 court employees, a budget of almost $4 billion, and having to go up to Sacramento regularly and often in crisis mode to defend the branch against cuts in its budget.
Well, you talk about that in the book. That, I mean, there was a certain amount of lobbying that went into your position running the courts. Another thing I loved was you visited all 58 counties in California, including Little Alpine County on the Nevada border.
Yes.
Tell us what made you want to do that. I mean, why go out into the field? Why not just stay in San Francisco?
Well, I felt it was important to demonstrate my interest in performing all aspects of my role, namely being Chief Justice for the entire state and not just having come from Los Angeles, being viewed as a Los Angeles judge running the state with the large counties just in mind, but the small counties had their own particular problems and challenges and solutions. And what I did was, somewhat spontaneously, I was asked to give a State of the Judiciary address to a joint session of the state legislature in the state capitol 2 weeks after I became Chief Justice. And in that initial speech, which I've given every year, an address of that type, I committed myself to visiting the courts in all 58 counties my first year as Chief Justice while performing my other duties such as writing opinions.
Sure.
And I learned a great deal, and out of those visits came some very fundamental structural reforms to our whole judicial branch, which with the help of the various governors with whom I served and the legislature, we managed to get enacted, and I'll just mention what they are briefly. First was a switch from county-based funding for the trial courts to state funding. And despite the cuts, I think that we're far better off than if we were competing at the county level with all the social services and parks and police and other budgets that are imposed on the various county governments. Secondly, we got a constitutional amendment on the ballot that passed by a 2-to-1 vote, unifying the 220 separate courts, trial courts in the state, which were justice courts, municipal courts, and superior courts, into one level of trial court, a superior court, one court in each of the 58 counties.
Well, let me stop you right there, because I was going to ask about consolidation, which is, so 14 years later, was consolidation the right thing to do, in your opinion?
Oh, there's no doubt about it. We eliminated all sorts of inefficiencies. We had courts where you'd go into the courthouse and you'd have a civil filing window at one level for municipal, another one for the superior court at the other level. Same for criminal. Separate jury pools and jury commissioners, separate interpreter services.
And you mentioned in the book some of the, of course, inadequacies of doing that way. However, wasn't there an argument for locally elected judges in the days of the municipal court, particularly in Beverly Hills, for example?
Of course, judges are still elected, but they're elected on a county-wide basis.
Right.
And I think the advantages of having a county-wide basis for the election of judges and the administration of justice under a statewide format definitely outweigh the local needs, because you had parts of LA County, for instance, Huntington Park, and then other districts 2 or 3 miles away where they were all bunched together, and it makes much more sense this way. Purchasing of supplies, for instance. You had municipal court judges who were done with their caseload at perhaps 2 in the afternoon, their short trials and preliminary hearings, and the superior court judges were facing dismissal of last day felonies and had no way of coping with it. So we merged them together, and there's much better service to the public, which is ultimately the criterion that was most important to me. And then this third of the 3 reforms was transferring the ownership and management responsibilities for the courthouses themselves from the counties to the state under judicial branch management. So those are the 3 structural reforms that made all sorts of other reforms, whether it's jury reform or interpreter services reform. We have more than 100 languages that we translate in our California courts, everything from A to Z.
It's tremendous.
I could go on and on.
And
but
you talk about it. You talk about it like the
that
book.
was all made possible by these 3 basic structural reforms.
The book is The Quest for Justice in California. My guest, Chief Justice Ronald M. George. Back to courts closing. Why are we still closing courts? I mean, why can't the judiciary balance the books to the point where we can keep some of these local courthouses open? I mentioned Beverly Hills, of course, but there's been others in the state. Why are we still closing courts?
The answer is very simple. The other 2 branches of government, the executive and the legislative, have not been responsible in terms of the funds allocated to the judiciary. And there have been hundreds of millions of dollars cut from the judicial branch budget over the last few years. And without restoring adequate funds, now that the funds are coming back with Prop 30 having passed and so forth, and I think it's highly irresponsible. And what it's doing is it's cutting down the public's access to justice. The closing of courtrooms or entire courthouses, the diminution of services, and there are some counties where people have to drive 70, 80 miles to find a courthouse. Parts of San Bernardino or Riverside counties, because of those closures. And that's entirely why it's happening. The public is paying taxes for various services, including, in my opinion, one of the most important services, and that is judicial services, and yet is not having enough funding allocated by the other 2 branches for that purpose.
I want to ask you about some of your colleagues, and of course you talk about them at length in the book. Start with Stanley Mosk, who was a mentor for you, very well known, of course, here locally. Tell me a little bit about your relationship with Judge Mosk over the years.
Well, I had a wonderful relationship with Justice Mosk, even though we didn't always see the same way on various legal issues. And he hired me out of Stanford Law School as a deputy attorney general when he was attorney general of the state. And then not too long after that, he was elevated to the Supreme Court of California by Governor Pat Brown. And Justice Mosk himself characterized his relationship with me as one of 5 phases. He said, well, first of all, he said, I hired Ron George as one of my deputies as Attorney General. Secondly, he said, when he, Moss, went up to the Supreme Court, I argued before him as a Deputy Attorney General. Third, when I became a trial judge and later a Court of Appeal justice, as a Supreme Court justice, he reviewed my work. Appeals from my rulings as a trial judge went to him. Fourth, I became an associate justice and we were colleagues. And then, as Stanley Moss put it, fifth and finally, Ron George became my boss when I became Chief Justice.
Yeah,
so
sure.
it was a
Sure.
wonderful relationship and a real friendship that developed over the course of three or more decades.
Comes through very, very clearly in what you wrote. The late Otto Kaus, of course, we knew, and we knew Peggy, who just passed away a couple years ago, his widow. Otto was on the court prior to you getting on the court, but of course you knew him. Can you tell us a little bit about Otto?
Well, I very much enjoyed, as a young Deputy Attorney General, arguing before Justice Otto Kaus, who was then on the 2nd District Court of Appeal, Division 5, I believe. And he was very lively and quick-witted in his questioning, and that always posed a challenge to the young deputies who argued before him. At the same time, he was always there in the coffee shop of the building, of the old state building there, ready to chat with new lawyers and very accessible.
He, of course, has that famous quote about, with regard to judges coming up for re-election, which was words to the effect of, it's hard not to notice a crocodile in your bathtub when you're shaving, right?
Exactly.
Is that an accurate depiction of, as a judge, being independent, but also realizing that you do come up for reconfirmation and the dilemmas that go along with that?
Well, it is a dilemma in the sense that it's something you can't help but be aware of, but you have to put it out of your mind. And if you would be concerned as a judge with how to decide a case because of the political or other personal ramifications, then you don't belong on the bench and it's time to hang up your black robe. And when there were attempts to sometimes influence or even intimidate the justices of the California Supreme Court on very hot-button issues, those were cases that I often made a point of assigning to myself because I felt the Chief Justice should have the broad shoulders to withstand public criticism and pressure.
You didn't run from controversy. There's no question about that. Of course, much has been made in recent years about in re marriage and the cases associated with same-sex marriage, which you ruled on. Can you tell us just briefly how you went into the decision-making on that? And I know, of course, you talked about it in the book, but tell us just briefly a little bit about that.
I'll be glad to. I just don't want to omit, just since we mentioned other Beverly Hills connections to the court, of course, that my predecessor, a very fine Chief Justice Malcolm Lucas, also is a Beverly Hills resident now. So there's quite a Beverly Hills
always is and always will be, hopefully,
link.
But yeah.
But getting on to your question about the marriage case, that case, like the parental abortion case that I assigned myself several years earlier, was one that I think we all knew would result in a lot of public reaction from one side or the other, whichever way it was decided. And I decided that it was a case that I would assign to myself. What was interesting about the decision was that, contrary to the usual practice, instead of just circulating a draft opinion to my colleagues, I made an appointment with them the day before they would get the draft, and I said, I'm going to do something very unusual. In addition to meeting with you about the case before I circulate the draft, my draft will have two possible outcomes to it, and I will weigh heavily the input that each of the six of you gives to me in formulating my own views. Mm-hmm. Well, they were interested, surprised to hear this, and when I got back their input, it was 3-3, so I was in the deciding seat on that issue, and I did, in addition to the research that my staff and myself had done, I did weigh heavily her input, and I came out the way I did after having given the case a lot of consideration and the oral arguments, of course, in addition to the briefing of the lawyers and of many, many amicus curiae, friend of the court briefs. I don't think we ever have had anything approaching that. There was, I think, somewhere between 50 and 100 organizations or individuals who filed friend of the court briefs to help assist us in our resolution of the issues.
Very interesting. When you retired from the court at the end of 2010, you said you didn't want to do arbitration, you didn't want to work for a big firm. You were even approached to be a law school dean at one point. Why? I mean, why didn't you want to go necessarily back into full throttle into the practice of law?
Well, I don't think there would have been much point, really, in retiring, even though I could have taken it at a much lower pace in practicing law than the 24/7 responsibilities I'd had as Chief Justice. There were a lot of things that I had to sacrifice, and frankly, things that I wanted to share with my wife, who, by the way, was also Beverly High.
Yes.
Graduate and
Well, let me ask you.
highlights editor, and I wanted to do those things and enjoy life and read and reread things and travel and spend time with family, including 2 grandchildren, instead of getting back into the work routine.
Barbara's a big part in the book. I mean, you mentioned her several times. Let's talk a little bit about, first of all, the California Arts Council and also some of her work that she did, particularly when you went up to San Francisco and when you first started serving on the Supreme Court. I mean, tell us a little bit about Barbara's role in that and what the activities she pursued.
Well, she was, by appointment of 2 governors, on the California Arts Council, a government agency, and she was elected chair for 3 terms. And she asked me when the court was about ready to move back into its permanent quarters in San Francisco, because the court had to vacate those headquarters for 10 years due to the reconstruction, retrofitting after the Loma Prieta earthquake. She said, how much art is being plan for the building? What is the funding allocated? And I looked into it and I said, 0. And she was surprised because she knew that federal and local provisions required a certain percentage. So she managed to obtain about $1.5 million of the funding that was in the bonds that had been responsible for the retrofitting, for the purchase and commissioning of art, photography, oil paintings, sculpture, and so forth. And she oversaw that and transformed the cold government structure, in the words of some people, into a living, breathing, wonderful place to work. So she was very much involved in that, and with so many other things that I did and made sacrifices while I was so involved in my duties as Chief Justice. And in fact, even through the book, because she read through the manuscript once it was transcribed from the oral history tapes and edited it with me.
There's a great story in the book about how you had photos of all the Chief Justices except for one, and you put your staff on the task of finding the missing Chief Justice photo. Just tell us briefly a little bit about that.
Well, I suppose it's part of my compulsive nature, but it bothered me to see, over 100 justices all lined up in a block-long display of photographs along the inner hallways of the court, and have one missing that had not been located from the mid-1800s. So one of my eager beaver research attorneys volunteered for the task, and he followed all sorts of leads that led him, not physically, but through correspondence and phone calls through several states, some false leads, and then finally found a photograph of the missing Justice Bryan, and that got placed there in the hallways along with the other colleagues.
What's the future of the court? First of all, we mentioned courthouses closing, obviously, and what do you think is the future of the court, both on the local level and also on the statewide level?
Well, there are many challenges that face our court system, and even aside from these draconian cuts in the budget for the judiciary, one of the real challenges is that justice, access to the court system, is becoming more and more difficult for people. And I don't mean just people at the very lowest part of our social economic spectrum, but even for people who would consider themselves middle class. Mm-hmm. Legal services are becoming something that are out of the reach
when
of
you
many
mentioned
people.
that even like in family law cases, something like 90% of the cases are pro se. I mean, it's unbelievable how little access many communities have to legal representation.
Exactly. We have done everything we can. We've set up self-help sites, also a website. We have legal services funding. There are lawyers who contribute their services pro bono. We have special projects, but even legal aid has to turn away about 6 or 7 people at least for every person it's able to accept. So that is a real challenge, and I think we have to devise procedures that are less expensive for the smaller cases, let the corporations fight it out with scores and scores of lawyers and complicated investigative and discovery techniques, but we have to have simplified, expedited legal process available for the public, because otherwise the court system will truly be inaccessible.
Yeah.
And that's a real challenge.
My guest is former Chief Justice Ronald M. George. The book is Chief, The Quest for Justice in California. Since the book has been out, tell us some kind of reactions you've gotten, or maybe some unusual reactions you didn't expect. Or are you hearing from different people? What kind of reaction are you getting?
Well, I think people are attracted by the conversational, anecdotal nature of it. And people who are not lawyers have been pleasantly surprised to see that there's a lot that is quite comprehensible.
And there's a lot on California history too. It's not just about the courts. I mean, there's a lot going on in a lot of the scenes. But go ahead, yeah.
But there are other parts that are clearly inside baseball for lawyers in terms of how the court might assign and process cases and so forth. So it's a combination of things. I think I've been rather candid about some subjects, including my views on the United States Supreme Court recent cases in certain areas. And I like to joke that now that I've retired, I'm no longer a second-class citizen when it comes to First Amendment rights. And I can speak my mind much more clearly.
You turned down an appointment to the Ninth Circuit. That was very interesting too. Something I wasn't aware of in your career. You just loved California that much. Is that what it was, or what really came down to it?
Well, I'd been on the municipal court, on the Superior Court, and then I was eager to return to appellate work, which was what I was doing as a California Deputy Attorney General, as a lawyer. And I waited after putting in an application for the State Court of Appeal, and nothing came about. So I inquired whether it would be bad form or be perceived as overly ambitious to put in for the federal appellate court at the same time, even though my preference was for the state system, having grown up, worked in it. And I was told, no, that's fine, but we wouldn't expect you to, let's say, get an appointment at the state appellate court and then leave immediately after for the federal appellate court if that came to be offered. And sure enough, that's what happened. After I was appointed to the state appellate court, I was offered a position on the Ninth Circuit, having been asked to appear twice in Washington, D.C. for a set of day-long interviews, which I did. And I explained to them, no, I'd made a commitment and I wasn't going to do that. Now, it happened to be that my preference was to stay in the state system, but I think they were incredulous that I would turn that down.
A lot of people would be, of course, and you mentioned, too, that the Sunday night trips to Guam and Northern Mariana Islands are not necessarily that appealing for the Ninth Circuit. Of course, they're seated in all kinds of different places, right? Because
Portland
of the size
Seattle.
of the size of the district.
9 states and territories as well.
Yeah. Tell us about your sons. We mentioned them earlier. What are they up to?
Well, our eldest son, Eric, is an attorney, and he has a firm which he is managing, which is Brown George Ross, located in Century City, and they are a firm that does business litigation primarily, and doing very well. They just opened a San Francisco branch, and Eric is often flying around the country handling matters in other states as well. And our middle son, Andrew, is a successful photographer who's had exhibitions not only in California but in places such as Australia and Eastern Europe, and taught a photography class last summer for National Geographic in London. And he's also involved in other creative pursuits, but he's clearly the artist in the family in many, many different senses. And then our son Chris is working in the business side of the entertainment industry, and his specialty, his particular niche, is working on literary properties and transforming them into products that can be film or television and so forth. So 3 very different pursuits and 3 very different personalities, and yet what gratifies Barbara and myself to our great pleasure is the fact that they are very, very close to each other, and they will often take trips together. And Chris is the only one who is married, and he's married to a wonderful woman, Rebecca, who is by training a teacher, but she has organized a charter school. She's involved in hiring for other educational institutes, and
there's a great scene
wonderful
in the book,
mother.
Great scene in the book where you're driving and your grandkids are in the back seat, and the Governor Brown calls up, and they're watching a movie in the back seat. And I think it was Chris said, "You're right. Well, don't turn off the movie because they'll be even louder if you turn off the movie, right?" So
that's right.
It's
They
kind
were
of a
watching
good balance between real life and your life on the court.
Yes, they were watching Rio, and he said, "Dad, if you think the squawking is going to bother your conversation with the governor, there'll be more squawking from
If you take
our
off
two
the
little
film, right,
girls,
Take off the
Charlotte and Maya, who
Yeah.
are the delight of our eyes. They're 5 and 7. So that rounds out the immediate family.
Yeah.
And I have a sister, Rita, who lives in Topanga, who's an artist, and we have also other relatives, Barbara's brother, Michael, and his wife, Anna Maria, who, by the way, she is an interpreter in the court system here and has been assigned to the Beverly Hills court
Very
building.
interesting, very
And Danish side of the family as well, because Barbara's mother was Danish.
Last question. What does the future hold for you, Mr. Chief Justice? What do you have left on your list of things to do?
Well, I have, of course, pretty much finished what I've done with the book in terms of having some appearances. And I have maybe three other commitments that are quite intriguing and worthwhile for me. I am a member of a committee called Think Long for California, which is tasked with coming up with structural changes to California government to make it less dysfunctional, let's put it that way. And it's been financed by somebody named Nicholas Bergruen, and he's a well-meaning citizen who's plunked down his own money to establish a bipartisan committee, and we have former Governor Davis and Willie Brown. We have George Schultz, Condoleezza Rice, Eli Broad.
And some very interesting issues
others.
they're tackling, too. I mean,
Exactly.
It's a lot of issues the state's going to face in the next 20, 30, 40 years.
Tax finance. My focus has been on reform of the initiative process. I'm also a member of a commission that is tasked with looking at the United Nations Universal Declaration of Human Rights and coming up with some updates for it, given the fact that it's about 65 years old. And we meet in different venues around the world. Every 6 months, we met in Edinburgh last October. We're going to meet in Bonn in May, and then Abu Dhabi, Shanghai, and then present our report to the UN in New York. So that and civics education, I'm working with Sandra Day O'Connor and Justice Anthony Kennedy as well to bring about some much needed improvement in the education of our young people in civics.
Yeah, and you talk about that, and it's so needed, especially in today's climate. Mr. Chief Justice, thank you so much.
Josh, my great pleasure.
We will see you next time on Beverly Hills View.